Good evening. This is Dr. Long from Team 15, and I wanted to capture a discussion we had in Charlie 201 from the EUCOM commander's perspective as he looks at the strategic environment in his theater. From the EUCOM commander's perspective, what he's trying to do is say something intelligent about the future that would allow us to improve our position in terms of supporting the national policy and strategic objectives inside his region. And to do that, he's going to need to say something that addresses end states or next states, because he realizes that there is no real end state, but really a series of continuing next states and iterations. And so he's thinking of those paths that we might take to those end states and next states in terms of NAIs and TAIs at the strategic level. And he's really concerned about the drivers of change so that he can make an estimate of what the future might hold. He engages in strategic planning in order to reduce the probability of strategic surprise, which we would define as large-scale, fundamental, pervasive, persistent. And so what he can't afford to do is wake up in the morning and discover that the world has changed around him in significant ways that now invalidates all of his plans, all of his operations, his very understanding of how the world works in his region. So to avoid or mitigate against that kind of strategic surprise, he engages in continuous estimates of the situation. Now here's his challenge. It has to do with the nature of the rate of change, which is getting faster every day. When the framers first wrote the Constitution, it made sense to establish a requirement for a census every 10 years, because that was quick enough and comprehensive enough that we could gain demographic information about the world and policy choices could be informed. Now compare that to the viral world, in which some apparently insignificant event in Brazil now has become the news dominating item for the last 96 hours of the news cycle. So the EUCOM commander might be concerned with variables in his world and how they change, such as technology, politics, the economy, media, culture, demographics, education, and so forth. And he's got to be concerned not only with how they're changing and how fast they're changing, but also how they mix and how he integrates these different waves of change in such a way as to get a comprehensive understanding of his current situation. So here's the challenge. If we just look at the technology variable and consider Moore's law, which says that computer power doubles every 18 months, what that really means is, just looking forward over 10 years, computing power is going to increase by 128 times. And so to appreciate what that much additional computing power really means is more than just extending the trend lines from what's working today and imagining that a little bit faster and a little bit cheaper. No, in fact, that's going to alter fundamentally the very nature of the machines and technology that we're using in ways that we can't sort out with confidence yet. And that's just the rate of change for technology. And so when you start adding all of these other waves of change, you have to ask yourself, do they have a dampening effect on each other, or are they multiplicative? In other words, do you have to multiply the amount of change that's happening in any of these domains together in order to get an appreciation for how the world might change? So that's the challenge of the staff, is to say something meaningful about what's going on inside their lane and express that to the commander in the terms of, where are we, what's going on, what's changing, and what's driving that change. Because that's so dynamic, that the narrative that pulls all that together, the story that summarizes, becomes the truth and becomes more important than any particular set of facts associated with one of these variables. So the power of narrative to be compelling and convincing and to move people to action based on their willingness to accept the narrative becomes an important part of the strategic vision, strategic communication, and the communication ability of the EUCOM commander to set those terms in a persuasive way. So once we've got that estimate of the current situation by whatever means, we might say, that tomorrow is probably an awful lot like today, that the amount of change that happens in a 24-hour period may not be fundamental and significant. And maybe 2 days it looks a lot like today, and 3 days and 4 days. But at some point, we get a sense that the cumulative effect of this multiplication of change may take us out of our comfort level about predicting the future. If we look close enough, all we have to do is really just look at extending these trend lines of what's going on and project what tomorrow and the next day might be, and we might have some confidence that our future is knowable. We might call that the domain of rational planning, or the time horizon within which rational planning is an appropriate response to estimating what the future may hold based on our deep understanding of the current state. And so we might put inertia or the status quo as this zero line, and then establish something like a plus or minus limit on that, maybe a standard deviation or two, whatever that means, and say that as long as the events of tomorrow fall within that cone, then we can say that our current understanding of the world, or our previous estimate of the world, is still holding true, and we can act on the fact that we think we know what's going on. But at some point we might cross that line and have experienced a significant enough change that our previous estimate no longer feels satisfying as a comprehensive explanation. When we have a time estimate of how far out we think we can go until this rational planning becomes irrational or not satisfying, we might say we've reached the boundary of what we can compute about the future. And if you think back to the multiplication of these variables, the argument is that the future is coming at us faster each and every day, that this interplay of these variables causes that future wave to collapse on us, and beyond that future that we cannot compute, we might approach it as a form of strategic planning as scenario planning, in which we expect the future is surprising. Not that the future is noble, but that we expect to be surprised. And so when we're out here in the region of can't compute at all, we might look out some time frame and array the world, or the possibility of all possible futures, as this curve, and say this represents the range of all possible futures. Now we might say if inertia continues to be the case, or the status quo continues to be extended, we might call that maybe the most expected or the most evolutionary amount of change, in that we're not experiencing the kinds of revolutionary change that cause discontinuity or sudden leaps and surges away from the past reality, the overnight change. So we might say that if we thought that was the most probable, we might just simply be able to extend the trend lines and say, this is what the future is going to look like if nothing revolutionary happens. It's going to be an evolutionary amount of change. But as you move away from this zero line, you might be looking towards maybe less likely scenarios, and which contain more revolutionary events, or more revolutionary changes, either on this side or that side. Maybe this is a positive going towards our national interest. Maybe these are negatives. That doesn't have to be positive or negative, but it could be. And so one of the things we would notice that our imagination about what might change is what really draws this line of what we consider to be possible futures. Now, what we have to be careful of is that when we're considering scenarios, that we are not impoverished in our imagination, and we want to make sure that we are looking widely enough that we cannot be surprised. In this case, real strategic surprise would occur if there were some combination of events that came at us from outside of this expanding funnel that we've drawn, and that would be an indication that our imagination was insufficient. That would explain why in the Army design methodology or strategic scenario planning, it's so important to get such a multiplicity of perspectives so that you reduce the possibility of strategic surprise. We may not want it to happen. It may be a low probability event, but we want to have considered that issue and sorted out what we might do in order to reduce this strategic surprise so we can start acting in time. So now, instead of trying to pick the exact future which is most probable, what's important now is getting an array of future possible states and then taking a good sampling of those. And I've shown that as scenarios 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so we might vary some of the major variables or drivers of change, and say, let me describe a plausible, possible future in regions 1, 2, 3, and 4, which are significantly different enough from each other to the point where we would have to explore different policy choices or the world would be fundamentally different. Then, to ensure that we are not surprised, what's necessary is that our scenarios actually cover a wide enough region in this solution space, enough diversity in the solutions, that we have understood the kinds of things that might happen to us depending on which part of that range fan that we get to. And again, hopefully our imagination is not impoverished and we are not surprised by things well beyond the limits of what we thought was even conceivable. The problem with revolutionary change and black swans, however, is that this might just happen. So we've got to approach this with some humble yet active inquiry to start getting a handle on what might be the case. Well, once we've identified those maybe 3 or 4 different scenarios and we've thought about the kinds of policies and organizational structures that might be giving us competitive advantage, we can then plot some strategies that should be successful in those scenarios. What we can then do is say what kinds of drivers of change that are either latent or resting or hidden in the current situation, what kinds of drivers of change would cause the future to diverge from this zero line and move towards one of these scenarios 1, 2, 3, or 4. We might then use that as a way to map out some NAIs and TAIs and look for confirming evidence that we're in one of these lanes. And then we might say it seems because of the TAI and NAIs that we are headed more towards scenario 1 than scenario 4. And if we can get an earlier read on that, that might give us an opportunity to act with advantage in time to adjust to a significant difference from the future state, which might be just extending the trend lines along this zero line. So when we apply this sort of strategic planning IPB model to the future, what we're trying to do is appreciate all the changes that might take place, to remind ourselves that we cannot predict that future with certainty, and that would be a fool's errand, but that our challenge is really to appreciate the fullness of possibilities and ensure that we've considered enough alternative scenarios that we have ways of getting out of this trick bag before we actually get into it. And then to establish periodic reviews in such a way that we can update our estimate of the future, keep pushing that bow wave out, get our sensors deployed, and continue to revise this estimate of the current state. That is the function of strategic planning for that EUCOM commander, to reduce the probability of a strategic surprise. And it's the way that he has to go about building his planning team in order to ensure that he's got a wide enough range of perspectives to account for all these possible future states, so that, again, he won't be surprised. If he does this, then he has to answer this question: how do I say things now about the futures and initiate necessary movement so I can do things that don't seem to have negative consequences in any of those? If I can find things to do that support our policies in all 4 of those areas, such as having well-trained, proficient soldiers, properly resourced, effectively led, with a robust and powerful chain of command that uses mission command, perhaps I can build organizational flexibility into all my echelons so that at every level I'm prepared to cope with the possibility of dynamic revolutionary change whenever it occurs, and that I don't have to have them waiting for me to come up with some final solution, that in fact we can have all of our brains in the fight looking for evidence of these NAIs and TAIs and criteria, and ensuring that our mental model of the world is somehow reflective of the world as it actually exists. So that was our Charlie 201 insights. Thanks for your kind attention, and looking forward to more along this discussion.